Beneath the vast sweep of a canyon sky where the desert sun painted the cliffs in molten gold, a quiet story began to unfold, one that would not only bridge two worlds, but also stir hearts with the gentle power of forbidden love. Gideon Nash, slight of frame and worn from miles of lonely trails, had never thought his voice could carry weight in a place like this. He was used to being overlooked, the kind of man who slipped through towns unnoticed, his life measured in maps and rail lines that stretched endlessly across hostile lands. Yet on this day, in a silent ravine where even the wind seemed to hold its breath, he found himself on the edge of something that would shatter every certainty he had ever known. His horse trembled, eyes wild with the scent of danger still hanging in the air, and his own ribs throbbed with the memory of a fall that had left him vulnerable, cornered by men who sought his life. Then she appeared, Ayana. A name he would not yet know, but a presence that would sear itself into him like fire. She rose out of the canyon shadows with a grace that belonged more to legend than flesh. Her tall frame seemed to bend the light itself, a silhouette that moved with the raw precision of a predator. Her dark hair caught the glow of the sun, braided with bones and feathers that whispered of battles fought and spirits remembered. Her eyes were darker still, fierce and unyielding, and yet within their depths flickered something more dangerous than steel, a hunger, a question, a challenge. Gideon should have bowed his head, grateful for his rescue. He should have whispered thanks and kept his distance, as any cautious man would. But his lips betrayed him, carried by something larger than fear, larger than logic. "What happens if I touch you?" he heard himself ask, the words raw, trembling, filled with a strange electricity. The question was reckless, as though spoken by a man who had already accepted death. Yet her smile answered not with wrath, but with a glimmer that made his pulse falter. It was a smile both cruel and tender, the kind that dangerous women wear when they know they hold all the power, when they can see into the marrow of a man and weigh him against his own soul. She did not strike him down. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him as though he were a puzzle, her fingers brushing the leather cord at her throat in slow, deliberate thought. And in that pause, in that narrowing of space between them, the air itself seemed to hum with possibility. His life had been a series of maps, lines etched on paper that pretended to tame the wilderness. But here was a woman who could not be measured, who could not be contained by the neat geometry of ink and compass. She was danger and healing woven into one, wild as a storm, yet radiant with the promise of something deeply human, deeply alive. Gideon felt his heart pound with a rhythm that was not fear, not gratitude, but something new, the stirring of desire, the recognition of a soul that could unmake him or make him whole. She stepped closer, her shadow spilling over his smaller frame, and the scent of sage and smoke clung to her like a second skin. Gideon had to tilt his chin up just to meet her gaze, and in that moment the canyon ceased to exist. The dust, the danger, the blood that had nearly stained the rocks, all of it faded before the silent force that held them suspended between ruin and revelation. "Interesting question," she murmured, her voice like water flowing over stone, edged with both music and menace. Her hand, powerful yet poised, hovered as though she might test him, as though she might grant him the answer he sought. And so began a story that was less about survival and more about surrender. For in her eyes he saw not only the threat of destruction, but the fragile, aching truth that love often blooms where it should not. that sometimes the smallest man can awaken the largest hunger, and sometimes even a warrior's heart longs for the gentleness of touch. This was the moment Gideon Nash's life split into two, before her and after. Before, he was a man of maps and solitude, tracing lines across stolen lands. After, he would become something more, someone who dared to reach for fire, though it threatened to consume him. And as the canyon wind finally stirred again, carrying with it the promise of battles yet to come, Gideon knew one thing with a certainty that felt like healing poured into his weary bones. Whatever happened when he touched her, it would change everything. If this tale stirs your heart, let it linger like a flame within you. Share your thoughts, let your voice join this journey, and if you feel the warmth of these words heal even a corner of your soul, let that be your reason to stay, to subscribe, to walk with us further into stories where love defies the boundaries of fear and fate. Because sometimes the smallest touch can awaken the greatest story. And as the sound of distant hoofbeats began to echo through the canyon, heralding the danger that would pull them even closer, the world around them held still once more, waiting to see what choice would be made when love and peril collided. The canyon still carried the ghost of violence, scattered rifle parts, crushed earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood that had not yet dried. Gideon's breath trembled in his chest, his ribs aching from the fall. Yet the greater ache was the one blooming in his heart as he watched her. Ayana stood tall in the rising sun, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of one who had been born into battle and survived countless storms. Her arms were streaked with dust, her hair alive with the wind, but she bore herself like an untouchable queen, her very presence a hymn of defiance against death itself. Gideon had seen soldiers, gunslingers, even killers who lived for cruelty, but never had he seen anyone fight like her. Each strike of her fist precise, each movement fierce yet beautiful, as if violence itself had learned to dance. When she finally turned her gaze upon him, he forgot the throbbing pain of his body. Those eyes, dark pools rimmed with flecks of gold, pierced through his skin, through his fragile pride, and seemed to search for something hidden far beneath the surface. "You hurt?" she asked, her voice deeper than many men's, yet softened by an undercurrent that brushed against him like a healing wind. Gideon shook his head, though truthfully his bones screamed, words tangled in his throat. For what could a man like him offer a woman like her? She extended her hand, and as her fingers touched his, Gideon felt it. The surge, the spark, the living current that leapt from her skin to his. Her palm was calloused, forged from years of struggle, yet within that hardness was a tenderness that undid him. She lifted him as though he weighed nothing, her strength both terrifying and oddly comforting. Standing beside her, Gideon felt diminished, a small figure in the shadow of a storm, yet in that smallness there was safety, there was warmth, as though being fragile in her presence was not a weakness, but a kind of truth. "Why?" he managed at last, his voice rough, nearly swallowed by the canyon. "Why help me?" She studied him for a heartbeat too long, and then her lips curved in a smile that struck like lightning. "Maybe I like small things," she whispered, her words carrying a dangerous sweetness. "They break so beautifully." The sound of it shook him. Any other lips, any other voice, and those words would have been a threat. But from her it was a promise, a revelation that stirred something buried deep within him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm not that fragile." She laughed, a full-bodied sound that echoed through the canyon, rich and alive, like water rushing over stone. "No," she said, circling him slowly, her eyes roaming over him like a predator assessing prey. "But you look like a strong wind could carry you away." Heat rose to Gideon's cheeks. All his life, little had been an insult, a reminder of what he lacked. But in her voice the words sounded different, less like mockery, more like an endearment, as though in his smallness she saw something precious. She asked what brought him so far from the safety of towns, and though shame pricked him, Gideon answered truthfully. "I'm a surveyor," he said, "mapping territories for the railroad." The word struck her like a blade. Her face hardened, and she spat the word as though it burned her tongue. Railroad. White man's iron snake, tearing the flesh of the earth. The bitterness in her voice made the air heavy, and Gideon felt the weight of her anger pressing against him. He should have apologized, retreated, bowed to her rage. But instead, something within him rose, a small flame of defiance that surprised even him. "Maybe," he said carefully, "but it pays honest wages for honest work." Ayana stopped circling him. Their eyes met in the searing light of morning, and Gideon found himself gazing into a storm he could neither predict nor control. Her eyes narrowed, and for an instant he thought her hand might strike him down. Instead, she smiled wider, a gleam of respect mingling with danger. "You have fire in you, little surveyor," she said, and the word little once more landed not as insult, but as something tender, almost affectionate. He breathed deeply, gathering courage. "My name is Gideon," he said softly, as though placing the word into her hands. "Gideon Nash." She repeated it. Gideon, shaping his plain name into something strange and beautiful. Then she gave him hers. Ayana. Her name fell into him like an arrow and like a balm, sharp yet healing, foreign yet already carved into the chambers of his heart. Between them stretched a silence thick with unspoken words, unspoken possibilities. They stood in the wild hush of the canyon, the light growing hotter, the air trembling with tension that was no longer purely fear. And though their worlds were carved in opposition, his defined by maps and iron, hers by blood and freedom, something unseen was already binding them. It was then that Gideon felt the dangerous impulse swell inside him once more, the same reckless current that had already made him speak words no sane man would utter. His heart hammered against his chest as he whispered, almost against his will, "What happens if I touch you?" Her smile returned, slower this time, more predatory. She stepped close enough that her warmth radiated against his skin, close enough that the sage and smoke in her hair filled his lungs. "Interesting question," she murmured, her voice brushing his senses like velvet and fire. Her eyes gleamed with wildness, with the kind of promise that could heal and destroy in the same breath. But before his trembling hands could rise, before his foolish longing could test the boundary between them, the canyon thundered with the sound of hooves. Horses, many of them, charging toward the place where fate had set them down. Ayana's eyes hardened in an instant, shifting from dangerous play to solemn warning. "You need to leave," she said, her hand already reaching for the knife at her belt. Gideon froze, torn between the safety of escape and the fire that had just been kindled in his chest. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, echoing off the stone walls with merciless force. And still, instead of stepping away, instead of obeying, Gideon leaned nearer to Ayana, drawn to her by something stronger than survival. The storm was coming, but for the first time in his life, he did not want to run. The canyon braced for what would come next, and in the shadow of danger, their story pressed forward like a river, carving its path into stone. The canyon walls trembled with the pounding of hooves, each echo a warning carved into stone. Gideon pressed his back against the cold rock, his body aching, but his mind burning with something fiercer than pain. Ayana's hand found his in the darkness of their narrow hiding place, her grip steady and strong, a silent vow pulsing through her calloused palm. And the soldiers who entered the ravine were not drunken fools or careless wanderers. These men moved with discipline, their rifles gleaming, their eyes sharp with the practiced cruelty of those who hunted for a living. Their leader dismounted, boots grinding against the gravel as he studied the broken rifle and the signs of battle. Gideon's heart hammered so loudly he was certain they would hear it. But Ayana's closeness steadied him. Her breath warmed his cheek, her presence a shield more powerful than any weapon. He felt the heat of her body pressed against his smaller frame, her shoulder firm against his chest, her hair brushing his jaw with every careful breath she took. In that cramped space, Gideon understood something he had never known before, that even in fear there could be healing, there could be comfort, when one was not alone. The soldiers spread out, their captain's voice carrying with cold authority. Search every crevice. She's here. I can feel it. The words sank like stone into Gideon's chest, yet he could not look away from Ayana. Her jaw clenched, her eyes burned with fury she barely contained, and he knew she would fight, even against impossible odds. But 5 rifles against 1 woman, no goddess, no storm, no miracle could endure that. And Gideon, trembling though he was, could not let her face them alone. Her lips brushed his ear, her whisper sharp as a blade, yet tinged with a gentleness that soothed his racing blood. When I move, you run. No matter what happens to me, you run. The command struck him deeper than fear itself, for he was tired, tired of running, tired of living as if his life had no weight. Something in him broke, and from that brokenness rose a new strength, fragile yet luminous. He squeezed her hand, his voice low but steady. Trust me. Before she could answer, Gideon stepped into the open, his small frame bathed in the sudden blaze of sunlight. The rifle swung toward him, and though his knees quivered, his face betrayed only the mask of terror he chose to wear. "Don't shoot!" he cried, lifting his hands. "I'm unarmed!" His voice cracked like dry wood, but beneath the surface his mind sharpened. He saw the suspicion in the captain's eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on every soul in that canyon. "Well, well," the captain drawled, his gaze raking over Gideon. "A lost lamb." He spat into the dirt. "Tell me, son, did you see which way the Apache woman ran?" Gideon swallowed the dust in his throat, forcing his lips to shape the lie. "Yes, sir. She went north, toward the pass, looked wounded, moving fast." His words fell quick, desperate, as though wrung from fear. The captain's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering like a flame. But then he nodded slowly, gesturing for his men. "Mount up. If we ride hard, we'll catch her." The thunder of hooves rolled away, swallowed by the canyon's vast silence. Gideon's chest heaved as he lowered his arms, the lie still hanging in the air like smoke. And then she was there, Ayana, stepping from the shadows, her gaze unreadable. For a moment, Gideon thought she might strike him, thought she might scorn him for daring to interfere, but instead she came closer, her presence wrapping around him like fire and balm in equal measure. "That was either very brave," she murmured, her voice thick with something softer than anger, "or very foolish." Gideon met her gaze, his lips curving in a weak, trembling smile. Maybe both. The truth of it pulsed between them, carried on the rhythm of their ragged breaths. Ayana's eyes softened, the storm within them shifting into something that glowed like embers. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, right above the frantic beating of his heart. Her hand was warm, grounding, a healing weight that steadied the storm inside him. "I think," she whispered, her voice husky, "I'm beginning to like you, little surveyor." Her words washed over him like water over cracked earth, filling spaces he had long thought barren. He wanted to speak, to tell her what burned in him, but her hand on his chest stole every word. She leaned closer, her breath mingling with his, her presence overwhelming. "So, tell me again," she whispered, her lips brushing the edge of his ear. "What happens if you touch me?" The canyon was silent now, emptied of enemies, filled only with the thunder of his own heart. Gideon lifted his trembling hand, and for the first time without hesitation traced the line of her jaw. Her skin was softer than he had imagined, smooth against the roughness of his calloused fingers. Ayana's breath caught, her body still as though the gentleness of his touch had undone her far more deeply than the force of any weapon. Her eyes closed briefly, her lips parting in a quiet surrender, before snapping open again as if she remembered the danger of weakness. "Careful," she warned, though her voice was thick, trembling with something she could not conceal. "You don't know what you're asking for." But Gideon no longer feared asking. He no longer feared touching what was forbidden. He leaned into the fire, knowing it might consume him, but also knowing it was the only warmth he had ever truly wanted. And as the canyon wind curled gently around them, carrying the scent of sage and dust like a blessing, their story pressed forward, into peril, into longing, into the promise of something greater than either of them alone. The canyon wind quieted, as if the earth itself held its breath, watching what passed between them. Gideon's hand lingered along Ayana's jaw, his thumb brushing over the curve of her cheekbone, and in that fragile contact something vast unfolded, an intimacy neither of them had chosen, but which seemed written into the air, into the dust, into the very silence surrounding them. Her breath trembled, though her body was forged of bronze and steel. For the first time since he had laid eyes on her, Gideon felt he had touched the woman beneath the warrior, the soul hidden within the storm. Ayana's eyes softened, but only for a heartbeat. Then, as though she had caught herself on the edge of surrender, her expression hardened again. "This is dangerous," she murmured, voice low, weighted with shadows. "For both of us. My people would kill you if they found out. Yours would hang us both without hesitation." Her words cut clean, yet even in the warning there was the quiver of something else. Fear, yes, but also longing. "I don't care," Gideon whispered, his voice steadier than he thought possible. It was not bravado, but truth, rising from the deepest place inside him. He had lived his life, running, hiding, avoiding risks, and yet here, pressed close to this woman who could crush him in her hand, he felt alive for the first time. Ayana's gaze flickered, surprise widening her dark eyes. "You should care," she said, her breath brushing across his lips, her nearness overwhelming. "You should run as far as you can." "What if I don't want to run any more?" Gideon asked. The words poured from him like water breaking through stone, unstoppable. For a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to tilt, the weight of destiny leaning toward them. But before she could answer, the silence was shattered by voices, male voices calling her name in Apache, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls with grim inevitability. Ayana's body went rigid. Fear flashed across her face, but not for herself. For him. "My brother," she whispered, her voice a thread pulled taut. "He has found me." The hoofbeats that followed were quieter than the cavalry's, more measured, more skilled. These were no blundering soldiers. These were hunters, moving through their own land with the certainty of shadows. She stepped away from Gideon, creating distance, her eyes sharpening with the knowledge of what must come. "Hide," she commanded, her voice cold now, distant, as if severing the warmth that had bound them only moments before. But Gideon did not move. His chest rose and fell with a calm he did not recognize in himself. "No," he said, "I'm done hiding." Her gaze snapped to him, fierce and disbelieving. "You don't understand," she hissed, urgency flooding her words. "My brother Takakota leads them. He has sworn to kill any white man who lays a hand on Apache women. He has kept that oath before." The darkness in her voice told Gideon everything. This was no idle threat, no exaggeration. Death shadowed every syllable. "Then why aren't you with them?" Gideon asked softly, his eyes steady on hers. His question stopped her, cut through her fury. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenched, and then slowly words spilled like bitter blood. "Because I refuse to be their weapon any longer. They wanted me to seduce soldiers, learn their secrets, watch as my brother slit their throats. I told them I was done. That's why they hunt me now." The truth struck Gideon harder than any blade. Her strength, her defiance, her danger. They were not born only from pride, but from chains she had broken, from the choice to abandon cruelty, even if it cost her blood. "So you're caught between two armies," he whispered. "Your own people who would use you, and the soldiers who would hang you." "Now you understand," she said bitterly. "Now you see why touching me is dangerous, why you should run while you still can." But Gideon's hand found hers again, his fingers trembling yet unyielding. "What if there was a third option?" he asked. "There is no third option," Ayana answered, her voice breaking under the weight of certainty. "This is how the world works." Her eyes shimmered with the resignation of one who had lived too long in cages built by others. "The world is bigger than this canyon," Gideon said, his voice fierce now, though soft enough to feel like a healing wind. "Bigger than this war. We can choose our own path." For the first time, he saw hope flicker in her gaze, fragile as a candle's flame in storm winds. But then she shook her head, retreating back into shadows. "You don't know what you ask. I've done terrible things, Gideon, things that would sicken you if you knew." "I don't care about your past," he said, his words a vow. "I care about what you choose now." "You should care," she snapped, but the quiver in her voice betrayed her. The hoofbeats were closer now. So close Gideon could hear the snort of horses, the soft thud of moccasins against stone. 3 riders emerged from the canyon shadows, silent, deadly, their presence as inevitable as nightfall. And at their head was Takakota, Ayana's brother. He was like her in form, tall and carved from power, but where she radiated controlled strength, he blazed with fury. His eyes locked on Gideon, and in them Gideon saw not only hatred, but something sharper, judgment, as though he had already been weighed and sentenced. "Ayana," Takakota called, his English accented yet sharp. "Step away from the white man." Ayana's answer came swift and unyielding. "No." She moved to stand beside Gideon, not behind him, her body angled like a shield, though Gideon knew she needed none. The canyon air thickened with the tension of bloodlines and betrayal, of love and death braided into a single strand. Takakota's face darkened, fury carving hard lines across it. "You shame our family. You shame our people. You consort with the enemy while our brothers die." "Our brothers die?" Ayana retorted, her voice like steel. "Because you choose war over wisdom. I choose my own path now." "There is no path for a woman who betrays her blood," Takakota growled, his hand resting on the war club at his belt. Gideon felt the heat of his gaze searing through him, felt the certainty of his own weakness against these predators. Yet when Ayana had demanded he prove himself, he had promised, and running would mean breaking that promise. "She's not betraying anyone," Gideon said, his voice clear, though his body trembled. "She's choosing peace." His words startled even himself, but they rang true in the canyon, like an arrow loosed with purpose. Takakota's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Small man speaks big words. Small words from a big heart carry more weight than big words from a small one," Gideon replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. The other warriors shifted, one even smirking faintly, though the shadow of violence hung over them still. Ayana's hand brushed against Gideon's, a fleeting touch, but it carried the force of a vow. He was not alone. Whatever storm came next, they would face it together. And in the heat of that moment, Gideon knew the truth. His heart was no longer his own. It belonged to the woman who had saved him, to the warrior who now stood at his side against her own blood. The canyon waited, hushed and trembling, as love and fury clashed in the narrowing space between survival and surrender. And within that silence, the next choice would decide everything. Takakota's gaze burned with the heat of a forge, his jaw set in stone as the canyon swallowed the echo of Gideon's words. Around him, the other Apache warriors stood like carved shadows, their hands resting on weapons, their eyes measuring every flicker of movement. Gideon felt his chest rise and fall, each breath sharp against his ribs, but his voice had steadied into something larger than his fear. He had spoken not as a surveyor, not as a fragile man too small for the world's cruelties, but as one who had found a reason to stand unshaken. That reason stood beside him now, her presence a storm and a balm all at once. Takakota's war club gleamed in the fading light as his hand curled around it. "You think your words will save you, little surveyor?" His voice was rough with disdain, yet beneath it was a flicker, a shadow of uncertainty that even he could not hide. Ayana's hand brushed lightly against Gideon's arm, a gesture so fleeting it might have been imagined, yet it gave him strength enough to lift his chin and meet Takakota's fury with calm resolve. "I don't expect words to save me," Gideon answered, the canyon carrying his voice farther than he thought it could travel. "But I would die for her if I must." His declaration was simple, but it split the silence like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the horses shifted uneasily, as if they too felt the tremor of something larger than battle. Takakota began to circle him, his body taut with lethal grace. He was everything Gideon was not, taller, stronger, sharpened by a life of blood and survival. Gideon's slight frame looked pitiful against such force, and yet he stood still, eyes steady, heart blazing. "Then fight me," Takakota hissed, each word a stone thrown into the quiet. "Prove your worth, or die as the fragile thing you are." Ayana's eyes widened, but before she could speak, Gideon stepped forward. "If I win, she chooses her own path," he said, voice ringing with clarity. "If I lose, you'll never need to worry about me again." Takakota's smile was sharp, wolf-like, cruel. "You would fight me, little man?" "I would," Gideon replied. "Not because I can defeat you, but because sometimes the strongest choice is knowing when not to strike. Sometimes the fire of the heart matters more than the force of the hand." The words seemed to ripple through the canyon, brushing against even the hard faces of the other warriors. Takakota sneered, but there was tension in his stance, as though his certainty had cracked. Still, he raised his war club, his muscles coiled to break the small man before him. Gideon, trembling yet resolute, bent swiftly to the ground. His fingers scooped up a fistful of dust and pebbles, flinging it upward into Takakota's eyes with a desperate sharpness. The warrior cursed, stumbling back, blinking against the sting. In that heartbeat of chaos, Gideon seized one of the broken rifle fragments left from the earlier skirmish. But instead of turning it outward, instead of aiming violence at his enemy, he pressed the jagged metal against his own throat, his voice breaking through the charged silence. "Stop!" he commanded. "One step closer, and I end this myself. Let my blood be on your hands, and you will lose your sister forever." The canyon froze. Takakota's hand gripped his war club, knuckles white, eyes blazing with rage barely contained. "You think I care if you live or die?" he snarled. "I think you care about her," Gideon said, his voice raw, his breath ragged. "And she cares about me. Kill me or let me kill myself, and her heart will die with mine. Is your pride worth that loss?" The canyon breathed with them, the silence punctuated only by the restless snort of horses and the whisper of wind through stone. Ayana's eyes glistened, though her face remained a mask of steel. Gideon's hand trembled, but he did not waver, holding the blade firm against his own skin. The choice hung heavy, suspended between love and hatred, blood and mercy. Takakota's war club lowered fraction by fraction, his chest heaving with unspoken conflict. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, flickered with something Gideon had not expected. Doubt. For the first time, the great warrior faltered. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, his voice cold but edged with reluctant respect. "You win this time, Surveyor. But if you betray her, if you lead soldiers to our land, I will find you, and you will beg for the mercy you ask today." "I understand," Gideon answered, lowering the jagged weapon, his hand shaking as adrenaline coursed through him. Takakota mounted his horse with the fluid grace of one born in the saddle. He cast a final look at Ayana, his voice softer in their tongue, words Gideon could not understand, but whose weight was heavy all the same. Then in English he added, "Choose wisely, sister." The three warriors disappeared into the canyon shadows, leaving silence behind like a wound slowly closing. Gideon's legs gave way, and he sank to his knees, his hands trembling as the broken rifle clattered against stone. His chest heaved, his vision blurred with exhaustion and release. Then she was there. Ayana knelt before him, her dark eyes luminous, her presence like warmth poured into his shivering bones. She touched his cheek, her palm firm yet tender, her thumb brushing across his skin with a gentleness that undid him completely. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen a man do," she whispered. "It was the stupidest thing I have ever done," Gideon admitted, his lips curving weakly. "Perhaps bravery and foolishness are the same," she said, her eyes glimmering as her voice softened into something that healed more than it wounded. Her hand lingered against his skin, her gaze searching him, unraveling him. "You asked me once what happens if you touch me. Now I have a question for you." "What happens?" she whispered, her lips so near his ear he could feel the heat of her breath. "When I touch you." Before he could answer, her mouth found his. The kiss was not gentle, nor was it cruel. It was fierce and hungry, alive with the ache of denied years, the yearning of souls who had always been meant to collide. Gideon melted into her, his arms trembling as they wrapped around her powerful frame, holding tight to the only thing that had ever made him feel whole. Her strength pressed against him, yet within it was a tenderness, a healing force that poured into every wound he had carried through a lifetime of smallness. The canyon, so long filled with echoes of pursuit and danger, now rang with the silent thunder of two hearts colliding. Her lips tasted of smoke and sage, of battles survived and choices defied. For the first time, Gideon felt truly safe, not because the world had grown less dangerous, but because he had chosen to stand within the storm rather than flee from it. When at last their lips parted, both breathless, Ayana rested her forehead against his, her smile softer than he had ever seen it. "Now," she whispered, "you know." And in that moment, Gideon understood that whatever lay ahead, blood, exile, freedom or death, he had already chosen. He would walk beside her, not behind, not apart. The canyon no longer felt like a prison of stone, but like a threshold, a doorway into a life neither of them had dared to imagine. The night crept in, gentle and unyielding, cloaking them in its vast silence. Stars burned overhead, witnesses to vows unspoken yet already sealed. And in the healing warmth of her arms, Gideon felt for the first time that he had stepped into the story he was meant to live. The path ahead would be perilous, but it would be theirs, together. The desert night deepened around them, the air cool against their heated skin, yet within Gideon's chest burned a flame he had never known. Ayana's kiss lingered on his lips, like the echo of a storm that had passed but left the sky forever changed. She leaned into him, her arms strong and sure, and though the world beyond their embrace still seethed with enemies, in that moment he felt the rarest of gifts, peace. Her body was a fortress and a balm, danger and healing entwined. Gideon pressed his forehead to hers, and the silence between them was not empty, but filled with everything words could not hold. She pulled back slightly, her dark eyes shimmering with a light that was neither surrender nor defeat, but something softer, something only he had touched. Her fingers lingered on his chest, tracing the pounding rhythm of his heart, as though committing it to memory. "You should be afraid," she murmured, her voice husky with contradiction. "You are small, fragile. You have no weapons, no tribe to defend you. My brother may have spared you this night, but he will not forgive so easily." "I am afraid," Gideon admitted, his voice low but unwavering. "But fear doesn't change what I feel when I look at you. I have lived as though I were nothing, as though my size made me less. But with you, I feel more than I ever believed I could be." Her lips parted as though to argue, but his words pressed into her like an unexpected tide, softening the edges of her resolve. She shook her head slightly, braids brushing over her shoulders. "You do not understand, Gideon. I carry blood on my hands, blood of men who trusted me, blood my people demanded I spill. I lured them with smiles, with touches, and watched them die by my brother's hand. That is what I was meant to be, a weapon, a lure, nothing more." Her voice cracked on the last words, raw and jagged, and for the first time Gideon saw not the predator, but the wound beneath. He reached for her hands, folding them between his smaller palms, pressing warmth into the calloused skin. "You are not what they made you," he said, his tone soft yet firm, carrying the weight of a vow. "Every man carries scars, every woman carries burdens. What matters is the path we choose when we can finally decide for ourselves. Tonight you chose to protect me. That was not the act of a weapon. That was the act of a woman with a soul too strong to be bound by anyone else's will." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and though she did not let them fall, she allowed herself to breathe, to lean slightly into the warmth he offered. The desert wind curled around them, carrying with it a fragrance of sage and earth, a healing balm whispered by the land itself. Ayana exhaled, the sound heavy with years of weight she had never shared. "You speak like a fool," she whispered, though her voice trembled with something dangerously close to hope. "And yet, your foolish words make me wish they were true." "They are true," Gideon said, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her scarred knuckles. The touch was reverent, as though he were honoring not her strength alone, but the battles she had endured to survive. Every scar is a story of survival, and every story can be rewritten. She closed her eyes briefly, as though the tenderness in his voice were harder to face than the blades of her enemies. When she opened them again, her gaze had softened, though shadows still lingered. "You would run with me then?" she asked, her words testing, uncertain. "You would abandon your work, your people, your maps?" "My maps draw lines that cage the earth," Gideon said quietly. "But you—" He paused, his throat tightening with the truth that pressed against it. "You are the only line I want to follow now. Not the iron snake, not the orders of men who never see the land they carve. Just you." Her lips parted in silent astonishment, as though no one had ever dared to place her above the demands of blood and war. For a long moment she stared at him, her breath quick and uneven, and then she cupped his face with both hands, her fingers spreading along his jaw. Her touch was both fierce and fragile, trembling with a longing she could no longer contain. "You speak of a life that does not exist," she said, her voice breaking like the edge of glass. "Then let us create it," Gideon whispered, pressing into her touch. "The world is vast. Somewhere beyond these canyons, beyond the reach of soldiers and warriors, there is a place where no one knows your name or mine. We could belong only to ourselves. The possibility hung between them, fragile as dawn. Ayana's eyes searched his, her breath trembling as though torn between belief and despair. At last, she closed the distance, her lips finding his again with a desperation that spoke of both hunger and fear. Her kiss was fire and healing, pulling him deeper into the truth they both resisted, yet could no longer deny. When she broke away, her forehead rested against his, her voice a whisper carried only to his ears. "If I allow myself to hope, Gideon, if I allow myself to touch you as though you were mine, I can never return to what I was. Do you understand what you ask?" "Yes," he breathed, his arms tightening around her. "I ask you to be free, with me." The canyon seemed to lean in, the stars above glittering like silent witnesses to the vow forming between them. Yet before hope could root itself fully, the stillness broke. From the distance came the sound of voices again, this time harsher, closer, filled with the fury of men who hunted not shadows, but blood. Ayana stiffened, her head snapping toward the sound. "They are returning," she whispered, her tone shifting from tenderness back to steel. But Gideon's hand caught hers, firm and steady. "Then let them come. Whatever storm they bring, I will face it with you." Her dark eyes locked on his, torn between fear and something deeper, something healing that even danger could not smother. And in that gaze, in the mingling of terror and love, their story pressed forward into the teeth of fate, unyielding, unstoppable, bound not by chains of war, but by the fragile, furious strength of two hearts that had chosen each other against the world. The night bled into dawn with a sky painted in bruised lavender and gold, the canyon walls glowing like embers from a fire not yet gone cold. Gideon stood close to Ayana, his smaller frame wrapped in the vast shadow of her presence. But instead of feeling diminished, he felt anchored, steadied, healed by the simple truth that he was no longer alone. Her fingers brushed against his as they waited in the silence, the nearness of her touch more potent than any weapon. The riders had returned. He could feel it in the vibration of the earth before the sound reached his ears. The measured rhythm of hooves, the cadence of men moving with intent, the certainty of hunters closing in. Ayana's face was a storm held in balance. She looked toward the mouth of the canyon, where voices rose in their native tongue, sharp and commanding, echoing through stone corridors. She knew those voices better than her own heartbeat. Gideon could see it in her jaw, in the way her breath tightened. Her people, her blood, her brother. And yet she had chosen to stand beside him, to bind her fate with his. The weight of that choice pressed against them like the heavy desert air before lightning splits the sky. They emerged from shadow with the grace of predators, 3 Apache warriors astride restless horses, their silhouettes fierce against the pale morning light. At their center was Takakota, his presence unmistakable, his eyes lit with the same gold-flecked fire as Ayana's, but burning hotter, harsher, untempered by mercy. He dismounted with the fluid strength of a man who had lived his life in combat. His war club hung at his side, heavy as judgment. His gaze locked on Gideon, and in that instant Gideon felt every frailty, every weakness, yet he did not move. He held Ayana's hand and did not let go. "Step away from him," Takakota commanded, his English roughened but sharp, carrying the weight of blood. His voice struck the canyon like thunder, a demand born not of doubt, but of centuries of law. Ayana's reply was simple, quiet, but it rippled like a stone dropped into still water. No. She stepped forward, placing herself beside Gideon rather than apart from him, her chin lifted with unflinching resolve. The canyon seemed to hold its breath at her defiance. Takakota's fury flared. You betray your family. You betray your people. While our brothers spill blood, you lie in the arms of the enemy. I choose my own path, Ayana shot back, her voice a blade honed with years of silence now broken. I will not be your weapon. I will not seduce and kill at your command. I will not bleed for wars I did not start. The other warriors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Takakota and Ayana. Gideon could feel the air thickening, the ground itself bracing for violence. He forced himself to step forward, his body frail but his voice carrying the weight of truth. She is not betraying anyone. She is choosing peace. Takakota turned his full fury upon him, his dark eyes narrowing. And who are you to speak of peace, little man? You who map our sacred lands for the iron snake. You who draw lines on paper that tear the earth's skin. Gideon's throat tightened, but he did not flinch. You're right. My people have done terrible things. They've taken what is not theirs, broken promises they never meant to keep. But I am not my people, and she is not yours to command. The canyon went still again, save for the restless snort of horses and the whisper of wind. Takakota's war club rose, the threat clear. Gideon's chest ached with terror, but within that terror bloomed something steadier than fear. He stepped forward, his body small against the looming form of Ayana's brother. If I must die to prove I am not afraid, then so be it. But know this, I will not step aside. I will not let you drag her back into chains she has already broken. Takakota sneered, circling him, his body a coil of fury and strength. You would fight me? You who can barely lift a weapon? I would stand against you, Gideon answered, his voice calm though his hands trembled. Not with strength, but with truth. Sometimes the smallest flame burns brightest when all else is dark. The warriors exchanged glances, one of them snorting softly, as though the thought of such a contest was absurd. Yet Ayana's eyes never left Gideon, and in them burned a light he had never seen before. Pride, fear, longing, a fierce tenderness that pierced him deeper than any blade. Takakota lunged forward, his war club raised high. But Gideon did not meet him with steel. Instead, he bent low, sweeping dust and gravel into his hand, and flung it upward with desperate speed. The grit caught Takakota's eyes, making him stagger back, cursing in pain. In the heartbeat that followed, Gideon seized a broken shard of rifle from the ground. He lifted it, not against his opponent, but against himself, pressing its jagged edge to his own throat. "Stop!" His voice cracked, but it thundered through the canyon all the same. "One more step, and I end this myself. Let her watch me bleed, and that blood will be on your hands forever." Takakota froze, his chest heaving, eyes burning through the blur. Gideon's hand shook but did not falter, the sharp edge pressing firm enough to break skin. "I think you care for her," Gideon said, his voice low and ragged. "More than you want to admit." She cares for me. Kill me, or let me kill myself, and you lose her forever. Is your pride worth that?" The silence that followed was vast and suffocating. Even the horses stilled, as if awaiting the verdict. Ayana's breath was sharp at his side, her eyes wide with the horror of his gamble. Gideon's heart thundered in his chest, every beat echoing like the strike of a drum. Slowly, Takakota lowered his weapon, his fury tempered by something heavier, love, unwilling and bitter, but love nonetheless. His voice, when it came, was thick with venom and warning. "You live this time, Surveyor. But if you betray her, if you lead soldiers to our land, I will carve your heart from your chest with my own hand." "I understand," Gideon whispered, lowering the jagged steel, his body trembling with the aftershock of his defiance. Takakota mounted his horse, his gaze lingering on Ayana with a darkness that spoke of bonds frayed but not yet severed. "Choose wisely, sister," he said, first in Apache, then again in English, his tone softer, but no less heavy. With that, he and his warriors vanished into the canyon, shadows swallowed by the morning light. The silence they left behind was immense, broken only by Gideon's uneven breaths and the distant cry of an eagle wheeling overhead. His legs gave way, and he sank to his knees, the broken rifle clattering against stone. Ayana was at his side in an instant, her hands cupping his face, her eyes luminous with something fierce and unspoken. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen," she whispered, her voice trembling as though she herself had been undone. Gideon's lips twisted into a weak smile. "Or the most foolish." "Perhaps the two are the same," she murmured, pressing her forehead against his. Her touch was warm, grounding, filling the hollow places inside him with something healing and whole. In that moment, Gideon knew the battle was not won, nor was their path free of peril. But Ayana's eyes, softened by love yet sharpened by survival, promised him something greater than safety, a future that could be theirs, if only they were bold enough to take it. And as the sun lifted higher, spilling its light over the broken stones and wounded earth, Gideon understood that their story was no longer bound by fear or fate. It was bound by choice, by love, by the fragile, unbreakable thread that tied them together in defiance of the world. The canyon that had once echoed with the thunder of hooves now breathed only silence, broken by the murmur of wind through sage and stone. The warriors were gone, their shadows swallowed by distance, but the weight of their presence lingered like smoke after fire. Gideon still knelt upon the earth, his chest rising and falling in sharp tremors, the broken rifle shard slipping from his hand as though it had drained the last of his strength. Yet before despair could claim him, Ayana's hands cupped his face, grounding him, healing him with the steady warmth of her touch. Her thumbs brushed his skin, tracing the curve of his cheekbones, as if to remind him that he was real, alive, hers. Her dark eyes searched him, no longer the eyes of the predator, but of the woman hidden beneath the armor of strength. "You faced him," she whispered, her voice husky with something between awe and fear. "You faced my brother, and you did not break." "I would have broken without you," Gideon admitted, his voice raw, trembling. "But with you, I found something worth standing for." His words tumbled out like stones rolling free from a cliff, unpolished but unshakable. Ayana leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, a kiss both fierce and gentle, as though sealing a vow upon his skin. "You are not so small as you believe, Gideon Nash," she said softly, her tone carrying the power of healing waters flowing over fractured stone. "You are fire hidden in fragile bones." He closed his eyes against the surge of emotion her words ignited. He had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as nothing more than a wisp of a man too slight for the world. Yet here, in the hands of a woman who towered above him in strength and spirit, he felt larger than he had ever dreamed. He opened his eyes to meet her gaze, and within it he saw not only desire but a reflection of himself as he longed to be, worthy, unafraid, alive. The dawn stretched fully over the desert, spilling light across the canyon floor, and with it came the promise of departure. Ayana rose, extending her hand, the same hand that had once shattered bone and wielded knives, but now reached for him with tenderness. Gideon took it, letting her pull him to his feet. Their fingers intertwined, not by accident, but by choice, the contact steady and sure. "We cannot stay here," she said, her gaze sweeping the cliffs as if expecting shadows to return. "The world will not forgive what we are." "Then let us find another world," Gideon replied. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of hope that refused to die, and so they began to walk, leaving the canyon of blood and betrayal behind. Days turned to weeks, the wilderness unfolding before them like a vast, untamed hymn. They moved through mountains scarred by wind, across rivers swollen with spring rains, and into valleys where the grass bent in waves like an ocean of green. Gideon mapped no lines now. His compass was her hand in his path the rhythm of her stride beside him. At night, beneath a sky jeweled with stars, Ayana would rest against him, her long limbs wrapped around his smaller frame, her breath steady against his neck. In her arms he discovered what it meant to be healed, not by absence of wounds, but by the courage to live despite them. She whispered stories of her childhood, of songs sung around fires long gone cold, and though grief lingered in her voice, it was softened by the warmth of sharing. Gideon listened, his fingers tracing patterns along her skin, each touch a promise to honor the woman she had become, not the weapon she had been forced to be. Months passed, and the world shifted around them. In a small town far to the west, where mountains guarded the horizon and the sea sent whispers of salt on the wind, they found refuge. No one asked about the past. No one measured their worth by bloodlines or wars. Gideon became a man of quiet labor, his hands shaping wood and stone, while Ayana walked freely, no longer bound by orders or shadows. Together they built a life, each brick, each breath, each shared dawn a testament to the truth that love can survive where nothing else should. In the evenings, Gideon would marvel at her, the way her laughter softened the hardest days, the way her strength made him braver simply by standing near. She, in turn, would rest her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had once trembled in fear, but now beat with certainty. They were not perfect nor free of scars, but they were whole in ways neither had thought possible. And when the world grew quiet around them, when the fire burned low and the night pressed close, Gideon would remember the canyon, the question that had once leapt from his lips without reason, reckless and raw. What happens if I touch you? He would remember the danger, the hunger, the fear. And then he would look at Ayana, her dark eyes softened by love, her arms encircling him with fierce tenderness, and he would know the answer. What happens when I touch you? Everything. Life, freedom, healing, love without end. Their story became not one of survival alone, but of choosing each other despite every barrier. The giant and the small man, the warrior and the surveyor, the storm and the flame. They had defied fate, defied blood, defied the iron chains of both armies and families, and in the defiance had found something greater than victory. They had found peace. And so, if you carry this story within your heart, let it remind you that love does not bow to fear, that even the smallest hands can hold the greatest courage, and that healing comes not from forgetting the scars, but from daring to build a future in spite of them. If these words touched you, if they left even a spark of warmth within your soul, then let that spark live on. Leave your thoughts, share your heart in the comments, and if this tale brought you comfort or hope, let your voice join ours by liking, by subscribing, by walking with us into the next story. For in every story, as in every touch, lies the promise of something greater than ourselves, something eternal.